And indeed, Tasmania Talks. Now, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, or the ABS, released on Friday its annual state accounts publication for the 2020-2021 financial year. So we've got our resident economist, Saul Eslake, on the line now to tell us all about it. Saul, a very good morning to you. Welcome.
Thank you for having me on your show again, mate.
So first of all, tell us a little bit about this state accounts publication.
Well, this is something that the Stat Bureau puts out once a year, around this time every year, which is the most comprehensive assessment of the economic growth of each of Australia's states and territories. We get, of course, monthly and quarterly a range of data on different aspects of each state and territory's performance: employment and unemployment, retail sales, housing approvals and things like that. And, of course, as we've discussed before, there's that State of the States thing that's put out by the ComSec, the Securities arm of the Commonwealth Bank, which, as we've discussed before, is really measuring whether states are improving on their past economic performance rather than how well they're going in absolute terms. This is the most comprehensive measure of overall economic performance for state and territories that's available. And the news this time for Tasmania was actually very good. Tasmania's economy grew, according to this, by 3.8% in the 2021 financial year. That's the best growth Tasmania's had in 2007-08. It's the fifth best that we've ever had, and it was the second best in the country after South Australia, which has hit us by 0.1 of a percentage point. It compares with a national figure of 1.4%. So Tasmania's economy grew at more than double the national average last year, which is something we can be very pleased about.
Indeed, we can. And you've also said that the two largest contributors from the demand side to the growth in Tasmania's economy in 2021 were a 4.5% increase in public spending and a 1.8% increase in household consumption spending.
Yeah, that's right. And a lot of the public spending was, of course, pandemic related, and in particular spending by the federal government. But surprisingly, the contribution to growth from public investment spending, that's infrastructure and the like, by federal, state and local governments and public corporations like Hydro and Tas Networks, that was only up by 2.5%. But we had strong growth in private investment, particularly house building was up by more than 11%. Business investment was also up by about 4.5%. The only bleak spot on the demand side was that our international exports were down by almost 10%. That's the third year in a row that our exports to the rest of the world have fallen, although the main factor this time, which won't come as a surprise, was that our exports of services, that's mainly tourism and international education, were down by 40%. And of course, that's a direct result of the closure of our borders, or Australia's borders, in the wake of the pandemic. And we know that that's going to change in now less than 3 weeks.
I know that also the growth apparently in the state's economy came from agriculture, forestry and fishing, whose value increased by a record 2.1%.
21%. Yes,
Sorry, 21%.
Right. Yeah, that's right. So that contributed almost half of the increase in economic activity in Tasmania viewed from the supply side. Now, that was the agricultural sector was rebounding from a decline in 2019-20 of 5.5%. It's inherent in the nature of agriculture that it goes through big swings depending on, among other things, the weather. And hopefully all the rain that we've had this time will lead to good crops and good dairy production and things like that over the coming year, which we'll see this time next year, whether that's continued. Of course, agriculture is more important to Tasmania's economy than it is to the economies of any other state. It was also a contributor to the slightly better than Tasmania outcome in South Australia, where agriculture is pretty important to that state. But also the fact that Tasmania went through this period without having any lockdowns was an important factor more broadly, especially by contrast with Victoria, for example, whose economy went backward by 0.4%, and that was obviously the result of them having been locked down for more than half the 2021 financial year.
I know that also something else is probably not as rosy. 47.4% of Tasmanians were employed in 2020-2021. It's the lowest proportion of any state or territory and 3.6% below the national average.
Yeah, this is one of the three reasons why, despite the better economic growth we recorded in 2021, we remain the poorest state in the country by a fairly wide margin if you use as your benchmark per capita gross product. Now, what that means is the value of goods and services produced in the state per head of population. That's still 20% below the national average, and there are three reasons for that, one of which is the one you mentioned, that only 47.5% of our population have jobs. That's 3.5 percentage points below the national average. The second reason is that those Tasmanians who do have jobs work an average of 1.25 hours per week, fewer than the national average, which might not sound very much, but when you multiply it out over the course of a year, that's 68 fewer hours of work per year by those who are in work, which is equivalent to having 10 additional public holidays every year, if you want to put it like that.
That'd be nice.
And the third, well, yes, but
no.
And the third factor is that Tasmanians who do work produce about 10% less by way of dollar value of goods and services for each hour that they work than the national average, or to put it in different terms, labour productivity in Tasmania is about 10% below the national average. And ultimately, labour productivity is what determines the sustainable level of wages. It's the main reason why wages in Tasmania are 10 to 15% below the national average. So you put all those three things together, a smaller proportion of the population who work, those who do work fewer hours, and for each hour that they do work, they produce less by way of dollar value of goods and services, is why Tasmania's per capita gross product is 20% below the national average.
And I noticed that you also wrote Tasmania is unlikely ever to close the gap with the rest of Australia in terms of participation in employment or income and wealth generation, while its young people are denied the same opportunities to acquire a complete secondary education as are available in every other state. End of quote from your good self.
Yeah, and what I mean by that is that there's oodles of evidence from around the world that one of the key things that influences whether people are employed or not, whether if they are employed they're working full-time or not, and irrespective of whether they're working full or part-time, how productive they are at work is how much education they have. And that in turn is very closely correlated with how much people earn in work. And Tasmania has, as we've discussed many times before, the lowest levels of educational participation and attainment in the country, anywhere except the Northern Territory, where educational participation and attainment's held back by the difficulties of reaching the large and scattered Indigenous population in the Territory. But apart from that, Tasmania lags well behind, and although things have improved a bit in Tasmania over the last 10 years or 20 years, the rest of the country hasn't been standing still either. We still have a smaller proportion, not just of people who left school 20, 30 years ago, but people leaving school today at an earlier stage than their counterparts on the mainland. And I continue to believe that one of the reasons for that is the structural break that our education system creates between year 10 and years 11 and 12, which doesn't exist in any other part of the country except the vastly different Canberra. And in particular, it's a barrier to completing a full secondary education by people who come from backgrounds where education hasn't been traditionally valued, where parents or grandparents might have left school at 14 and done all right and think that that should be the benchmark for their own kids, which isn't true anymore, if indeed it ever was. And, you know, I say, as I have done for decades, that if our system of separate secondary colleges is so good, how come no other state in the last 50 years or so that we've had it has seen fit to copy it?
Yeah, good call. I want to digress just quickly. I know we're running out of time to talk with you, but I know you said it was no surprise that Basslink, which owns and operates the electricity connector between Tasmania and Victoria, had gone into receivership.
Yeah, and well, it was no surprise for two reasons. One, because it had been well known. It was a matter of public record that Basslink was in a financially weak position. But, of course, with the arbitration between, on the one hand, Basslink, and on the other, Hydro Tasmania and the state government, resulting from the failure of the cable back in 2015-16, having gone against Basslink, and the Tasmanian government having shown a fair degree of forbearance towards Basslink over a non-payment of a settlement that was awarded in this arbitration, decided
$70 million
or so ago, that's right, to enforce its legal rights to collect that money from Basslink. They, it would appear, don't have the capacity to pay that, and so they have gone initially into voluntary administration, and as I understand it now, into receivership. Let me underscore, as the government has done, that this doesn't mean the cable will cease to operate. The contract between Hydro Tasmania and Basslink provides for circumstances like this, and as I understand it, the cable is still operating. Presumably, the receivers will now be looking to sell Basslink to someone, and I assume that they will at a price that might not be all that favourable to the previous owners of Basslink, but someone will buy it at some price, I would think. The difficulty they'll have in setting a price and finding a buyer is the uncertainty that exists at the moment as to whether Project Marinus goes ahead. If Project Marinus goes ahead, Basslink would still have a role, but it wouldn't be as valuable as it would be if Marinus doesn't go ahead, because it would then be the only cable and the only way of connecting Tasmania's electricity system to the mainland. My view is that it's very much in Tasmania's interest for Project Marinus to go ahead, and I hope it does, but that's obviously something that I can't know about, and at this stage, really nobody outside government circles can.
But the main argument for Marinus is the capacity it'll provide to enable Tasmania to provide what they say clean energy to mainland consumers. Look, Saul, I know that you've got to go, but I do appreciate your time this morning. Thank you so much, our resident economist, if you will, Mr. Saul Eslake. Thank you, Saul.
That's a pleasure, mate. Thank you for having me on again.
Good to talk to you indeed.